My name is Adam Crimble.
My name is Sarah Fox, and I'm part of a research team working on a BA-funded project called European Cuisine and British Identity in the Age of Nationalism.
And this is our paper, Hanoverian Flavours on the King's Table in the Long 18th Century. Just before church one Sunday morning in November 1789, an immigrant to Britain from a small northeastern German village gathered her 3 adult daughters at her home in Windsor for a religious lesson in German. The 4 women then went to chapel, where an English minister preached an Anglican service. These women were used to multilingual and cross-cultural instruction, having also learned French at an early age, and at least occasionally speaking to their mother in German. Theirs was a household that regularly welcomed people from around the known world, home to a number of German, French, and British servants, some of whom were explicitly replaced with Germans at the matriarch's command. 2 of the women would marry German men and live out their days in Central Europe, making their early broad cultural instruction vital preparation for their future abroad. Some of the women's brothers, too, spent time in Germany, learning the language before returning to England as part of their education. For their mother, German religious instruction was an opportunity to stay culturally connected to her place of birth and to pass along elements of her identity to her children. The mother was Queen Charlotte, wife and consort of George III, the ethnically German but English-born King of England and ruler of Hanover, and the daughters were the princesses. Together, they comprised one of thousands of ethnically German or Northern European families living in late 18th century Britain, whose members not only maintained physical links with the continent, but also cultural ones. This paper considers how an immigrant family at the center of the British universe retained and adapted its Germanness in the privacy of their own homes in the later 18th century. It does so through a look at the royal taste buds, taking a careful look at tens of thousands of dishes that graced the household tables of George III and George IV between 1760 and 1827, in order to identify traces of Germanic cultural consumption at the heart of the British establishment. In doing so, it builds upon a strong historiography of food history, studies of Britishness, and of migration, much of which turn a blind eye to German and Germanic influences on British culture, in favor of a more dominant Franco-British narrative, or one looking outwards at empire, ranging from Ben Rogers' Beef and Liberty to Troy Bickham's Eating the Empire, or Margot Finn and Kate Smith's edited collection, The East India Company at Home.
Much less prevalent are studies that consider connections to Northern Europe, which remains a significant blind spot in the English language historiography. The blind spot is also present in the key studies of Britishness, nationalism and identity, with the much-cited 1992 Linda Colley book, Britons, focusing on anti-Gallicism and anti-Catholicism as the basis for nascent Britishness in the early 19th century. Her chapter on the Hanoverian monarchs considers the king and queen in personal terms, painting them as boring, without addressing any potential of their German cultural connections. Given the attention Colley's book has gained, and its central place within the historiography on Britishness, the German blind spot has struggled to attract a gaze in proportion to its influence. For example, the idea of the Hanoverians as unfashionably dull is picked up by Ben Rogers, who writes that, quote, whereas in the 17th century the taste for courtly cooking was disseminated from the Stuart court outwards, the Germanic Hanoverian courts of George I, George II and George III were famously unstylish. Instead, fashionable French cooking became closely associated with the great Whig grandees who dominated the government and the country. Robert Walpole, the Duke of Newcastle and the Dukes of Richmond and Bedford, Lord Chesterfield and Lord Albemarle, to mention only a few, all employed top French chefs. End quote. Panicos Panayi has found what we've found to be the most convincing explanation for this historiographical German blind spot. The First and Second World Wars, which sculpted 20th century Britishness into something that was not German in a similar fashion to the 19th century not French identity that preceded it. Panayi argued that the wars effectively wiped out the German communities in Britain, forcing them to leave or to integrate. When the historians of the late 20th century began to write the great histories of British identity, surrounded by a fresh memory of Germany and the Second World War, it was not surprising that Germanness was left out of the discussion. Building from Panay's Don't Mention the War thesis, we wanted to test the degree of Germanness in an ethnically German migrant family for whom money was no object when it came to cultural performance of identity. The Georgian monarchs did not hide their dual identity, nor did they need to do so for the sake of public opinion. The British king had two constituencies, who spoke two different languages and potentially had different and possibly conflicting geopolitical interests. Yet George III's career marked a change in tack for the Hanoverians, as he was the first of them to be wholly educated in Britain and to speak English on a regular basis. Unlike his predecessors, George III was not entirely indifferent to how his subjects viewed him. Further, he is often quoted for the things he said about his love of country, of Britain. In his accession speech to Parliament, he had declared that, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." Indeed, Carol Percy argues that George III's use of concepts in the nation in his speeches were important indicators not only of his patriotism, but also of his desire to position himself outside of party politics. We may then lay at George's door the fact that the importance of German influences on British identity was smoothed out almost to invisibility, since it was he who was the first in line to place importance of fitting in and assimilating with his subjects.
Within this framework of competing identities and immigration, this paper considers the cultural role of Germanic societies in sculpting Britishness in the first stage of nationalism. It does so by considering how Britain's first family managed and expressed their dual German and British identities in the late 18th century, while considering how that experience allows us to recenter the European influences on early Britishness away from a model that relies too heavily on the relationship with France. To do so, we use household records, as well as various diaries and correspondences of key servants, such as the English Fanny Burney and German Charlotte Papendiek, both of whom were responsible for the Queen's robes at different times, and who offer many insights into life at court through different cultural lenses. Most importantly for this project were the bills of fare, which list daily menus of what was served to the royal family and members of their households, broken down by dish and the table for which the food was destined. These large format ledgers, which are part of a series of more than 300 similar volumes surviving in the National Archives and Royal Collection, were a means of keeping track of expenditure, signed off each day by the Board of Green Cloth, which oversaw the running of the royal household. The run of volumes survives with very few gaps for the entirety of the Hanoverian monarchy in Britain, and includes select volumes of George IV's regency. Our work focuses on two volumes. The Kew Ledger, 1788 to 1801, which includes the dishes served when the King and Queen were in residence at Kew Palace, west of London. This included during his two most serious bouts of mental health crisis. The other is an 1812 volume from Clarence House, detailing the same for George IV when he sat as regent. Our work on this is ongoing, but from what we've done so far, between these two volumes include 30,000 dishes served to 86 parties, across 674 days. To this, we hope to add a similar volume from the kitchen of George II, pandemic pending, and our understanding of these records will continue to evolve as we keep working with them. To provide some focus to this paper, we will be looking at certain diners only. They are George III and his German wife Charlotte, contrasted against their son, the future George IV. They were chosen because they left the richest records, but also because they represent how an immigrant family puts generational distance between the homeland and the adopted country. Charlotte had been raised in Germany. She had living knowledge of Germanic cultures and customs. Both George III and George IV did not, though George IV had visited Hanover. Secondly, we look at two key servants in the households, one British and one German, to ask how their own tastes and national culinary influences may be discerned. They are Martha Caroline Goldsworthy, the English-born governess of the royal children, and Juliane von Schwellenberg, the fierce German keeper of the robes, loved by Charlotte and reviled as Old Schwelly by everyone else. Both had specific food allocated to their tables, which, as we will see, varied quite substantially from one another in interesting ways. Before we can get to that, we must establish what German food was and how we might recognize it on an 18th century table. Like any cultural practice, German cuisine shifted across space and time, did not fully respect borders, and varied a little from household to household as per individual tastes. It faced steady outward influence on all sides, with French, Nordic, Mediterranean, Turkish, and New World flavors imported as ingredients or adopted and adapted as recipes. Importantly, German cuisine was split fairly cleanly evenly in two at this time, as was the area that we now think of as Germany. The split was roughly a north-south one, separating the predominantly Catholic, High German-speaking, Alpine inhabitants of places such as Munich from the Protestant, Low German-speaking, lowland inhabitants of Hanover, Hamburg, and Berlin. The northern part was formerly part of the trading confederation, the Hanseatic League, which from the late medieval to the early modern era helped culturally connect the cities of northern Europe along a west to east axis that saw goods and practices shared across rather than down Europe. This was part of the world that looked to the Baltic and North Seas as both highways and sources of the raw materials of life. For our paper, it was that lowland northern region that was most interesting to us, as this was the ancestral home of the Georgian kings and the birthplace of Queen Charlotte. It is therefore the northern cuisine that we'd expect to find on the royal table if a culinary cultural exchange was taking place. But which foods and flavors were part of this cuisine?
Much of what we think of today as German food, from pretzels to Black Forest cake, are traditional dishes of the Bavarian south, not the region we're interested in today. Instead, the food we're looking at is fairly simple and plain fare, dominated by soup, stew, dairy, fish, pork, certain vegetables, beer and grains. It was a palate dominated by whites, greens and browns. There have been suggestions by Sabrina Moser that the North German plate was aligned with the simplicity and honesty of Protestant ideals, which she argues cannot be understood independently to Protestantism's influences on the local culture. This connection to Protestantism, which is a characteristic German food shared with British culture, may help explain why German influence has historically been a bit invisible.
In terms of the specifics of flavors, butter acted as the principal fat, both in northern Germany and across northern Europe, as distinct from the oil of warmer climes to the south along the Mediterranean. Favorite dishes include soup in particular, which was regarded as fundamental to German cookery. It featured heavily in German cookery books of the day, and, as in England, was a staple part of the diet. It was often served with stale bread grated in or placed at the bottom of the bowl to thicken and increase the calorific content, or served with an egg yolk for extra protein and a silkier texture.
Despite also being popular in England, soup held greater cultural significance in Germany. Biersuppe was a daily part of Frederick the Great's breakfast routine, and apparently not having access to good soup was grounds for leaving your master. That was what happened to a German prince named Puckler in the 1820s, who was visiting England in search of a wealthy English bride. He claimed that his German servant, unhappy with the soup in London, left his service and went back home, where he could be better fed by his reckoning. Puckler was at least somewhat sympathetic, describing British soup as having been, quote, brewed in a witch's cauldron, end quote, containing all sorts of peppers and spices from both Indies. So soup was important to both cultures, but it was consumed in different ways. Closely related was the importance of stews, Eintopf, or one-pot meals, which Gunther Wiegelmann showed were particularly characteristic of northern middle-class cooking in the region, and set the area apart from the more grain-based and often meatless diet in the south of Germany. As far as flesh went, the northern German love of a fairly wide range of fish, especially Baltic and North Sea fish, including herring, cod, pike and mackerel, set them apart from the culinary giants, the French, who ate from a much narrower selection of seafood. So too did the Germans' love of all things pig, which was shunned as miserly and a tolerated necessity in French cuisine, but more central to the German meal. Most important amongst pork was, of course, sausages, and cured pork such as ham and bacon. German visitors to London remarked, perhaps as you would expect, on the abundance of roast beef here. The fact that British beef stood out to them suggests it was not as important to German cuisine as it was British. Certain vegetables were also important in this part of Germany, including those we might regard as simple or having hearty flavours. Cabbage, parsnip, carrot, beetroot, and by the 18th century the potato, which became a staple source of calories in the countryside by 1800, replacing the more traditional porridges and gruels. To keep life interesting, herbs such as parsley and chive and spices including mustard were typical add-ons to German cookery dishes. Finally, coffee, a Turkish import, took German culture by storm, becoming the go-to hot drink culturally on a par with tea in Britain. The exception to this was in George's own ancestral home of Hanover, where British influences had made tea the local drink of choice. This northern German taste profile is one that is confirmed both by the historiography on German cooking and by the German cookery books of the day.
Back across the channel, German foodstuffs, or at least German-inspired foodstuffs, were fairly widely available in 18th century Britain, and could be purchased at Italian warehouses that specialized in continental imports. An adapted recipe for the German delicacy Westphalia ham was available by the 18th century, though according to English travelers and German expats alike, it was apparently inferior to the version one would get from Hanover, where chimneyless houses led to a deeper oak-smoked flavor, and the addition of juniper berries likewise changed the taste of the German version. Ready-made German food was also available for sale in London eateries. German and Bologna sausages were available as well as ready-dressed hams in Nichols' Beef Shop in Bishopsgate Without. Heinz Ham, Beef and Tongue Shop in Clements Lane sold Westphalia hams as well as reindeer, and the staff spoke everything from Russian to High Dutch. The Four Nations in Nassau Street sold English, French, Italian, and German cuisine. Yates in the Strand was a ham and beef shop selling smoked puddings both of Bologna and Germany, and this dual Italian-German shop was a reasonably common combination in London. Germans were also known to consume some of this German food while here in Britain. Charlotte Papendiek, one of the Queen's keepers of the robes, included sauerkraut, sausages, and roasted pork on the menu at her wedding day feast in London, alongside a hearty veal and parsley soup. At her child's christening, Metwurst sausages and mulled beer were included in the offering. Within the British psyche, there was certainly an awareness that the Germans ate differently from us, and continued to do so after arriving on British soil. A number of British caricatures, a genre that highlights perceived difference and accessible across the social strata, make symbolic use of food as a shorthand for considering national identity and otherness. Perhaps the most German of those is Gilray's Germans Eating Sauerkraut, published in 1803. The image shows 5 Germans with poor table manners devouring heaping plates of sauerkraut and sausages, while a servant brings yet more of the same for the next course. The marks on the steins and plates on the floor identify the site as a real German eating house in West London, run by a German immigrant named J. Wehler. The 5 pigs eating from their trough in the framed image on the wall reflect the inelegant eating habits of the 5 diners, as well as the strong association between German cuisine and consumption of pigs, as already mentioned.
Cabbage, the basis of sauerkraut, was widely available in Britain, but was culturally associated with German eating, and we believe makes an appearance in another famous Gilray image, Temperance enjoying a frugal meal, which shows the miserly George III and his wife Charlotte eating far below their means. The greens on Charlotte's fork and in her hair were described by Dorothy George in 1938 as salad, but given the known Germanness of the Queen, we suggest that sauerkraut is more likely. Alongside cabbage, sausages were important culinary indicators of Germanness in satirical images, particularly in the early decades of the 19th century. They also offered the caricaturist entertaining potential for double entendres. German sausages, as a euphemism for German princes and royal brides, also makes connections to the German love of pig products, as in the 1818 caricature of the royal granddaughter in search of a husband. Of course, if food in caricature could represent foreign eating habits, it could also represent British ones. The second half of the 18th century increasingly saw the image of Britannia, a feminised representation of Britain as a warrior queen, replaced with images of John Bull, a fat, hearty, well-fed common man. Bull was popularly depicted in contrast with emaciated Frenchmen, their physique representing the differences in their national food identities. Characteristically, Bull is well fed on a hearty diet of meat, which is something German visitors to Britain also noted in their travel diaries, both the volume of food served and its focus on the bovine. The roast beef of Old England, made famous in song by the Beggar's Opera and in print by Hogarth, really gained traction in satirical prints in the final years of the 18th century. It was predominantly an urban phenomenon, as Emma Griffin's work has shown. For British agricultural workers, meat remained a rarity. However, rather than being the actual daily food of the British people, roast beef was a symbolic food associated with economic success, masculinity, plain speaking, and fitness for political power. As such, the consumption of roast beef was often as much about the rejection of narratives of elite effeminacy and degeneracy, often shorthand for Frenchness, and the promotion of emerging middle-class ideas of national character and identity. OK, with Germanness established, that brings us to our next question. Were George and Charlotte, or their son, George IV, eating in a recognisably German way? Well, no, not obviously so. Most of what they ate can be best described as local or British or perhaps English. More than 8 in 10 of the dishes served to George III and Charlotte fit this category. From roasted mutton to stewed spinach, tenderons of veal and fried sole, most of what they were served suggests no strong external influence whatsoever. In many respects, this is not surprising. They are, after all, the British monarchs, and they had little option but to eat primarily foods that were grown locally, though some long-distance food markets were bringing in delicacies from abroad and had been for centuries. In fact, of nearly 1,700 unique dishes served at the Palace at Kew, most of the top 10 most common ones were fairly strongly associated with British tastes. The list, of course, includes the famous roast beef, though not at the top. It also includes 2 types of roast poultry, both as chicken and the neutered cockerel form known as a capon. Perhaps most interesting here is that of the most commonly served dishes, only 2 of them are what we would call made dishes, the tarts and the chicken broth. The rest are really just heated ingredients that formed the staples to which much more variety was added around the edges. Of the vegetables, asparagus in particular stands out as one that was also a German favourite, spargel, but would have been widely available and consumed in England too. The artichokes are, of course, a Mediterranean botanic import, but may well have been grown locally by this stage. Nothing too German to see here.
Neither do we see a great deal of Germanness when we look at meals the king ate on his own. This happened a handful of times, often when the queen was off travelling elsewhere, when the king arrived in advance of his wife by a few days, or perhaps at the suggestion of his doctors, during periods of illness when extra dishes were prepared. The interesting thing here is actually how starkly the diet changes, from one full of ceremony and more than a dozen dishes on the table, to food that looks strikingly like it was destined for the tables of the servants. It would seem, given the choice of a simple meal, George liked a good chunk of meat, mutton, fowl, or beefsteak, and a nice tart, cherry if it was available. This was very similar to the profile we see of the king's clerk of the kitchen, a middling servant in charge of the ledger, and a very English-looking set of options with a few more exotic tastes thrown in from time to time.
Despite the dominant British nature of the cooking in the royal kitchen, there were some strong foreign accents, but French ones, not German. In fact, the royal table was set each day in accordance with the à la Française style. Not only a physical layout for the dishes, but a formula that dictated which types of dishes should be served in which proportions, and which Jean-Louis Flandrin describes in detail in Arranging the Meal. This was a formula developed in France which became central to the ceremony of aristocratic dining from the late 17th century until well into the 19th. It entailed 3 to 5 courses made up of a number of dishes in predefined proportions of food functions: a soup, an hors d'oeuvre, an entree, relevés, a roast, a salad, entremets, and a dessert. The à la Française meal thus followed a set format that sculpted the work of the chefs, but with tremendous room for variation within it. French influence wasn't limited to the table setting. There were also a huge range of obviously French-inspired dishes on the Georgian royal tables, from French regional dishes such as soup à la Normandie or soup à la Crécy, to French pâtisserie ranging from blancmange to beignet to puy d'amour, to a wide range of French linguistically named dishes from fricassee to haricot to blanquette, matelote and even ragout. French influences on the cooking culture of the royal household run deep. In the Q ledger, which covers the food of George III, dozens of dishes of French influence are described using French language, with 1 in 7 dishes destined for their majesties clearly French in some way. That's 1,038 of 7,599 dishes. Access to French flavours declined as you traversed down the social hierarchy of the household. The royal pages, who also ate lavishly, saw about 1/3 as many French dishes proportionately as did the king and queen. The lesser servants received none directly, though some had access to the leftover food of others as a perquisite. We have yet to complete our dataset on George IV, so we're unable to draw direct comparisons in the data, yet we can already see some significant differences in both their diets and the diets of their households. The influence of the à la Française style manufactures similarities in the types and numbers of dishes on the table. George IV differed somewhat from his parents in that he seemed to be incredibly fond of creamy foods, which may explain his girth in later life. He also had extremely boring eating habits. The ledgers show a routine meal which, whilst extensive and fairly luxurious, was very repetitive. New foods were rare in the 1812 ledger, and when they were tried, they rarely became part of the regular offering at George IV's table. George IV also liked to keep a well-stocked side table. On any one day, this would include lamb or mutton, roast beef, roast chicken and ham, all served cold. The ledger for his parents' meals, however, only recorded a side table of food on one occasion, with cold mutton and 2 chickens, on the 28th of April 1801. If these records show us anything, it's that there are definitely different tastes on show across these two families, and that while there are similarities across aristocratic diners, there are also substantial variations that show individual cultural expression and performance.
So where's the German influence? Well, it's there, but it's not at the centre. It's encroaching around the edges and often hidden under a shared set of British and French tastes. The menus include about 24 dishes out of 1,700 that we can fairly unambiguously suggest are German in origin, if perhaps locally produced in at least some cases. This includes what may have been foods imported directly from Hanover, such as Hanover goose, partridge, and turnips, rather than necessarily indicating a German recipe. Regular gifts arriving from Hanover make up at least a portion of this obviously German food. George IV's surviving records show regular shipments of hams, pig's heads, boars, deer, liverwurst, blood pudding, and metwurst sausages arriving in the 1820s. These German dishes are really quite rare on the royal table. Only 200 out of 22,000 dishes in the Q ledger were obviously German. That's 1%. Hardly a strong German influence. That is, until you start looking more closely at the taste profile more widely. George III and Charlotte in particular ate a very wide range of species, including a number that were more common to Germany and Northern Europe than to England. In particular, key Baltic and North Sea fish, including herring, perch, pike, and mackerel, of imported occasional treat species such as ortolan, a small songbird that most of us wouldn't see the value in eating, which was also popular in eastern France, and choices of vegetable that are typical of taste and growing conditions across Britain as well as Northern Europe: potatoes, kohlrabi, asparagus, broccoli, and spinach. In other words, a taste profile that wouldn't look out of place in a wealthy German household of the day, based on our analysis of German cookery and of the existing historiography. Importantly, these Germanic species are most strongly correlated with dishes finding their way to the king and queen. In other words, when herring appears, it tends to be the king and queen who eat it. Likewise for fish such as pike and perch, none of which feature heavily in the foods of their son, George IV, suggesting a distinct taste preference for the king and queen. This, we argue, is typical of what we might expect to see in an immigrant family holding on to elements of home, while at the same time adapting to the local realities of what's available and considered normal in their adopted country. Even when they're eating like English people, they're doing it in a German-inflected way, making subtle choices that reflect the German palate, though not the full breadth of German tastes. For example, the king and queen show no great fondness for cabbage, despite Gilray's cartoon, and in fact, cabbage and sauerkraut are much more common on the table of their son, despite himself being further ancestrally from Germany than his parents. George IV even had a sauerkraut budget line specifically in his expense book, receiving his pickled cabbage from the very J. Valar, whose eating house was caricatured in Gilray. We also see some German cultural imports making their way onto the breakfast table. Not recorded in our ledgers, but described by an unnamed servant in a letter, Queen Charlotte was a coffee drinker in the morning. George drank tea. This love for coffee was one that she shared with her German servant, Mrs. Schwellenberg, who Fanny Burney recorded in her diary as never drinking tea. Of course, there was nothing preventing British people from drinking coffee, or Germans from drinking tea. Both were widely available in both locales, and coffee had a long history in Britain. Writings by those at court presented the dual presence of coffee and tea as totally normal. But Charlotte's apparent preference for coffee does strike us as one of the many markers of subtle German taste at court, especially given the extensive scholarship, including by Karen Harvey, that suggests tea drinking was gendered towards female consumption in Britain, making Charlotte's choice doubly culturally significant. Like the witch's brew soup Prince Puckler complained of, coffee in Britain was apparently produced differently than in Germany, with one German traveller warning his fellow compatriots to make sure you give your English barista explicit instructions on how to make the coffee strong enough. Unfortunately, we don't know if Charlotte's coffee was the weak English or the strong German sort, but given the large number of Germans in the royal household, we suspect it was the strong stuff. The couple also made other German drinking choices, or at least their chefs did. The royal kitchen went through much more German hock in cooking than wines from other regions of Europe, appearing 65 times in the Kew Ledger, compared to 33 appearances of French claret and 25 of Portuguese Madeira. This preference for German wine is not mirrored by George IV, whose household mensal books record far more port than any other alcohol.
The German reputation for simple flavours might also help to explain why we see none of the more intensely flavoured Indian curries that we might expect, given the growing influence of Indian culture on Britain and of George IV's obsession with the East, best seen by his rather eclectic and Asian-inspired Brighton Pavilion, which was at the height of British chinoiserie, but whose table saw far more sauerkraut than tikka masala or chicken chow mein. Also notably absent were African and North American recipes, though as I'm sure you're aware, plenty of ingredients from each, including sugar, with Troy Bickham's book Eating the Empire providing a good overview of the influences of colonial ingredients on British cooking.
These so-called exotic absences, to us, only reinforce the importance of the admittedly small number of German recipes we're seeing in these volumes. Since the choices came from such a narrow cultural range, being at the table, so to speak, was a signal of cultural importance that we shouldn't overlook.
The dominance of French cuisine across Europe makes it very difficult to identify other national influences when looking at ledgers. Even where a dish had no real French identity, it might be given a French name in order to conform to the expectations of the day or to satisfy the chef. But our research shows, we think, that it is still possible to identify Germanic foodways in the meals of the Hanoverians well into the 19th century. By looking not at dishes or preparation techniques, but at flavours and species, we've been able to identify elements of Germanic culture in the food served at the king's table.
As a European-facing household, home to servants from across Europe, the ledgers also provide additional opportunities to probe cultural consumption. The German bodies included those of guests, such as Maximilian Jacobi, a German doctor with experience treating mental illness, who visited George III for 3 days in October 1791. Possibly to provide a German view on the king's malady. He was allocated a very British dinner, according to the ledger, showing that German tastes were not explicitly catered for when guests were in residence. Whether this was a chance to treat the German doctor to some local fare, or a reflection of his perceived status, we don't know for certain. Despite a strong preference for French chefs in the aristocratic kitchens of England, George III had a number of German chefs in his employ. This included Johann Peter Werner, who in 1765 received a letter patent endorsed by the Duke of Württemberg, future father-in-law to the king's daughter. At the time of the Kew Ledger, George's confectioner was also a German, a Frankfurter named Friedrich Kuff, who also had a confection shop in London. Kuff was well versed in a range of continental treats, from French macaroons to Savoy biscuits and raspberry creams, receipts for which have survived, showing that even German hands made French foods, while also bringing with them the experience of having worked and cooked in German territory. Perhaps most interesting is the opportunity to consider how servants of different cultural backgrounds ate differently. There are two in particular who stand out as potential representatives of their nations. They are Juliane von Schwellenberg and Martha Caroline Goldsworthy, German and English respectively. Schwellenberg was perhaps the most obviously German woman in the royal household. She was mocked for her German accent by Fanny Burney's diary and was widely known within the household as one of the German servants, and a woman who knew her own mind. She accompanied Charlotte from Mecklenburg-Strelitz to England in 1761 and stayed in her service as a close servant and confidant until her death in 1797. She was one of two named servants regularly present who were allocated specific food in George III's household, the other being Miss Martha Caroline Goldsworthy, the English sub-governess to the children. Both appear regularly enough that it's possible to build up a taste profile for each. Schwellenberg had 189 dishes, Goldsworthy 509.
When we do that, we see quite different profiles for the two women, suggesting they had different senses of taste. Goldsworthy ate what we might describe as an Anglo-Franco diet, leaning heavily towards Anglo. There was a lot of meat. 60% of dishes were cooked flesh, including quite a lot of cow, a good helping of pies and tarts, 17%, and a good bit of soup, 10%. The French tastes tended to be in the form of sauces for her meats, which were relatively common and form a broad set of options compared to Mrs. Schwellenberg. The sauces include bechamel, lobster, robart and oyster sauces, to name a few. So, moist meat, a soup and a nice dessert for an Englishwoman. Mrs. Schwellenberg was served quite a different set of foods. She received far less meat, far more vegetables, 26% of dishes served, far fewer sauces, and in general fewer sweet foods, only half as many puddings as Miss Goldsworthy. Neither woman ate stews, and Schwellenberg wasn't served anything that looked particularly French to us, except perhaps for a single marmalade tart. She also didn't seem to eat much soup, showing that she was not aligned with all German taste preferences, just as Charlotte showed some German tastes but not others. The meats they get are also different and prepared differently. Miss Goldsworthy was more likely to get a big hunk of meat, and fairly often it was boiled. Miss Schwellenberg saw daintier cuts, such as sweetbreads and tongues, ate a lot less cow and sheep, and stands out as the person most likely to receive her meat sliced. According to one of Schwellenberg's German colleagues, Germans had a particular dislike of rabbit, and we can confirm Schwellenberg never saw one on her table, though Charlotte did from time to time, whether she ate it or not. All this is to say, she definitely gets fed differently than anyone else in the house, and her consumption profile, particularly around species of animal and plants consumed, looks more similar to the princesses than Miss Goldsworthy, who is fed more like the clerk of the kitchen in that regard. Given what we know about Mrs. Schwellenberg's strong personality, we're fairly convinced that she had a hand in ensuring that difference. We've produced a table showing the foods that overlapped across the diets of the two women and those that were unique to each. Schwellenberg's apparent preference for simple vegetables strikes us as consistent with the types of flavours and more modest consumption she would have known at home in Mecklenburg-Strelitz, which was less prosperous than Britain, and so she may simply have been used to a more economical diet focused on veg than a comparable Englishwoman.
Allow us to summarise what we think this all means. We set out at the beginning of this project to rectify the absence of German culture and histories of British food specifically, and British identity more generally, by exploring the role of some choice Germanic immigrants and their foodways in shaping ideas of Britishness at a point in time when nationalism was as yet evolving. What did Germanness look like in such a household? And what does that mean for the historiography's obsession with the French?
This has proved much harder than we had hoped it would be. The ledgers contained no smoking gun, no steaming vat of sauerkraut or glut of liverwurst. Instead, we found an abundance of Frenchness, just as the historiography suggested we might. Perhaps this isn't so surprising, since French food and French styles of service were as dominant in German aristocratic dining as they were in English ones. So too was the French language, which remained the language of diplomacy throughout the period. We certainly don't want to suggest that France and French culture were not important or even dominant on the European culinary scene. But Germanness, like Britishness, was fighting to find its feet at this point, trying to distinguish itself from the clutches of Frenchness, just as Britain too was striving to define itself. In both cases, food was one of the ways it did so. In 1885, more than a decade after German unification, the General German Language Association was founded with the purpose of, quote, cleansing the language, protecting its specific German character, and re-establishing German national traditions, end quote. The association's first publication, the German Menu, Die Deutsche Speisekarte, started taking back control of the German language by focusing on the German food lexicon as a space where foreign influences could be expunged. What we eat matters to our understanding of who we are. But even a century before, we see clear evidence of something that was distinctly part of a Northern European, Germanic, if not explicitly German, food culture. And by searching below the surface of the sources and the French descriptions on the menus, we've also found traces of that German culture here in Britain, on the royal table and on the tables of other comfortable Germans in England.
It showed itself as a Metwurst sausage on offer at a christening of a German child in London, or as a bill for sauerkraut on George IV's account books. A cup of coffee for a queen and her favorite German servant in the morning. It also showed itself in more subtle ways. A modest but steady arrival of edible porcine gifts sent from Hanover to keep the king on side with the interests of his German subjects. A selection of Baltic fish for a German Queen of England's supper. And a general palette of flavors consistent with one that might be grown in the fields back home in Mecklenburg-Strelitz.
The Hanoverians may have been Protestant enough for the crown, but we shouldn't forget that they were also culturally distinct in many important ways from their English hosts. Their arrival brought some stability to British high politics, but also helped pave a cultural pathway to Northern Europe that demonstrably, if subtly, changed Britain in the decades that followed by creating a new demand for elements of German culture. As the Kew Ledger and its 1,700 unique dishes show, the Britishness that emerged was thus not merely a reaction against Catholicism and Frenchness, as has been suggested. It was also a bit of Westphalia ham, a glass of Rhenish, and a big slice of Kuchen. We've forgotten that in the historiography, as Panayi has suggested, in part because of the war. We'd like to suggest that now is the perfect time to bring German influence back into the story.